All right. Hey, everybody. This is the introduction to our newest unit. We're going to be talking about early humans. We're going to go over some of our key vocabulary terms and some of the pieces that we're going to make sure we need to know. So, as we go through this, right, our timeline shows a timeline of the Paleolithic era, which started about 2.5 million years ago and went till about 10,000 BCE, also known as before Common Era. That gets us into the Mesolithic time period, and that lasted for about 2,000 years until we hit the Neolithic, which lasts another 5,000, and we get to the Bronze Age and then the Iron Age, right? So the Paleolithic is the Stone Age. It's also called the Paleolithic. This begins about 2.5 million years ago, but ends about 10,000 BCE. During the Mesolithic era, they used small stone tools, and this is where they begin to use agriculture, so they can begin some settlements. In the Neolithic age, people switched to agriculture and domesticated animals. And then we move on to the Bronze Age, and people start to make some more technological advances during this time period, which would include things like metalworking, and the wheel is invented, and textiles or fabrics become more known throughout these areas. And this is where we start to see cities begin to form. And then we've got the Iron Age, and then during this time period, people began making tools and weapons with steel, and it lasts about 400 years. So that's kind of an overarching timeline of some of the things we're going to be talking about. So the Stone Age, right? They call this time period the history, the Stone Age. And this is where people are making tools and weapons out of stone. The early part of the Stone Age is known as the Paleolithic, and in Greek that means old stone. The Paleolithic age starts about 2.5 million years ago and lasts until about 8,000 BCE. So, people of the Paleolithic, right, they were known as nomads. That means they moved from place to place to survive, really in the hunt for food. They would travel in these bands or groups of about 20 to 30 members, according to the historical record. The nomads were what we would call hunter-gatherers, right? And this depends on where they lived. They hunted animals such as bison, buffalo, wild goats, and reindeer. People near the rivers and coasts, they would fish. But also, they would gather wild foods like nuts, berries, fruits, grains, grasses, and green plants. And we would start to see that they do the hunting as well as the gathering. And that was really their main mission, was to find food. One of the interesting things that archaeologists have learned about the past is that men and women were essentially equal and made decisions together affecting the entire band. And some evidence would suggest that they worked together to find food for themselves and their children. And this was kind of the first formation of what we see as families. Men and women did have specific roles within the band, right? Men, they were out hunting the large animals. They'd go after them with clubs, or they'd drive them off of cliffs. And eventually, they developed stone tools like weapons, such as spears, that they could then hunt the animals with. Women generally looked after the children. They took care of the camp, kind of the home base, and they would gather food from nature. So they were generally known as the gatherers. So some of the technology that we see, right? We'll talk about this, but let's talk about some of our vocab terms here. Culture, right, is stated here as the way of life for a group of people who share similar beliefs and customs, right? So it's kind of the way things are done with a certain group of people. The Paleolithic culture would include the tools and methods they used to get food. That would really come to define their culture. They also would have developed new technologies, right? And technology is defined as including the tools and methods gained by the practical use of knowledge. So when you would think about things, you would use these tools and methods to gain an advantage by thinking about it. Paleolithic people would hit what we call these flint rocks with another hard stone. And what would happen is that they would flake into pieces, and they had really sharp edges, and they would use this for cutting, and they would use it for things like a hand axe. So they would break apart pieces, so they would create these really sharp edges that they would then use as some of their tools. Some of the technological advances during this time period, over time, and we're talking over long periods of time, they would start to make more complex tools and weapons, right? So that we'd see the development of the bow and arrow to hunt animals, Spears and harpoons for hunting and fishing. Fish hooks made it easier to catch more fish. And then they would create tools for digging for plants and roots and things like that, and they're gathering. And then there's these scraping tools, and they would use this to clean animal hides, and they would use that for clothing or their shelters. They would also make needles from animal bones, and this would help them make nets, baskets, and clothing. And what this does is it allows the Paleolithic people to access a wider variety and greater amount of food, right? So we see that, again, it's helping them with the main piece of their culture, which is finding food. So some of the adaptations that we would see for survival is that they would adapt to their surroundings. So depending on where they would live, they had certain resources available to them, and that's how they would adapt to their environment. Some people in cold regions, they would make their shelters from ice and snow, maybe like an igloo. In regions that didn't have many trees, they would build shelters out of other materials. So even mammoth bones would be used. They'd cover those with hides, and they would use that as their shelters. And then in warmer climates, some people would simply live in caves and huts for safety and shelter. So you see one of these drawings here of a Paleolithic house that they would use the resources around them to create. Fire, a huge piece of it. To the left, you see the picture of a bow drill. This is a technique used when you don't have fire readily available. You had to create your own. So what they would do is they learn to make it with friction. They'd have a small piece or a tinder bundle made out of dry grass or leaves, and then they'd rub two pieces of wood together. So you see to the left, there's two pieces of wood, right? You've got the spindle, and then you've got the piece that is the base, and then the bow would allow to create that friction, which would then create a little cinder that they would put into their tinder bundle, and that would actually start a fire. Later, they'd use iron pyrite to start fires by hitting that with another rock to create a spark, and that would then be put into the tinder bundle as well. So again, the technological advances we start to see with things like the bow drill and those kinds of things, but we know the benefits of having fires, that of course it gave heat when things were cold. You could heat up your body as to not use up as much energy. They could cook their meat, which lasts longer. Wild animals, they don't like the smell of smoke. The fire would keep them away. And then they could use fire to flush out animals during hunts, so essentially to scare them or push them out of a particular area. Other advancements we would see would be with things like language. In the beginning, they basically would just use gestures and sounds, and then later they start to develop a spoken language, and then they can be more direct and use that to communicate more effectively. Other things that we notice are art, right? So cave paintings are what we talk about when we talk about art that can be found around the world, right? They would use these crushed yellow, black, and red rocks. They'd mix them together with animal fat that would make paint. They'd use twigs or their fingertips to draw things like animals that they hunted. Very little evidence of actual showing pictures of humans. But later their brushes would be made of animal hair. But a lot of the time people believe that this was used for rituals or simply things that would say, here's what we want to hunt, and they would manifest that, and hopefully they would find something that they could hunt and then eat for food. So we'll start talking about the Ice Age. This is a long period of extreme cold that affected the Earth. And what we see, the most recent ice age is about 100,000 years ago, and it lasted about 90,000 years. So this really cold time for the planet Earth lasted about 90,000 years. During this time, glaciers, which are thick sheets of ice that move really slowly, they would move across parts of the globe. During this time period, this is how archaeologists believe people migrated to the Americas at this time. So as the Ice Age began to warm, we would see that this is the hypothesis that is put forward. So parts of this area known as Beringia, right? So that area between Russia, Western Canada, and Alaska, this becomes ice-free. So the ice tied up a lot of that water, which then exposes this land, okay? And this happens about 18,000 years ago. They believe that this allowed people to spread across the Americas. And how this happened, we're not sure, right? So there are some different theories about how the Americas were populated. Natives, they believe that they had always been there. Their oral histories don't mention migrations from other continents, so that story had not been passed down, so they believe that they had always been in the Americas. During the Ice Age, when water levels were lower, this would expose that strip of land, like I said before, acting as a land bridge. And this would be a land bridge between Asia and North America. And people crossed it and spread southward into the Americas. That's kind of the most widely accepted theory out there. But others believe that they found sites across the Americas that date earlier than the land bridge, which leads us to believe that there were people here earlier than that. The Kelp Highway theory asserts that people actually used boats and they migrated down the Pacific coastline by boat, and that's how people got to the Americas. So here's some of our sources. I hope this information helps you out. Use this to fill out your notes, especially if you weren't in class at a particular time. Make sure you're asking questions if you get stuck. But otherwise, happy trails out there. And here we have the Paleolithic time period.